Welcome to Lecture 34. Have you ever wondered whether there's life elsewhere in the universe? Of course you have. And in doing so, you're hardly alone. It's been a subject that's captured the imagination of others for a great many years. How long do you suppose humankind has asked that question about life elsewhere? Well, let me assure you it goes way back. In this lecture, we're going to be concerned mostly with how the issue played out in the 19th century. But we'll have to back up a bit to set the stage for the fascinating events that unfolded then. Last time we learned about the enormous interest astronomers created with their talk of a new planet. And of course, there was the deployment of Lord Ross's telescope, with its impact on the debate about the nebular hypothesis. But these were not the only ways astronomy came to the public's attention in the 19th century. The contemplation of the heavens naturally produced speculation about the possibility of life elsewhere in the cosmos. And as I've already indicated, such speculation had a long history that merely came to a head in the 19th century. So let's turn to that history in order to appreciate fully the meaning of the issue in the 1800s. The matter of other worlds and extraterrestrial life has roots deep in the Western past, goes back at least to the time of Aristotle. He'd thought it over and concluded that the Earth, being the center of the cosmos, was the only place life existed. Aristotle had created one of the first geometrical systems to describe the heavens. It consisted of a series of homocentric spheres that expanded out until you finally reached the last one, the sphere of the fixed stars. Beyond that, nothing existed, not even space. So it didn't make sense to Aristotle that life would exist anywhere but at the focal point of this elaborate system. Clearly, Earth was where the action was. Now, although after Aristotle's time there were new systems created to explain the heavens, none of the ones that lasted challenged the notion that the Earth was at the center of it all and was immovable. And we know that during the years of the early Christian church, these Greek ideas about the cosmos were appropriated and became part of the Christian outlook. It was very compatible with the assumption that here on earth was where the drama of salvation was carried out, not elsewhere. The idea of an immovable earth at the center of the cosmos reinforced the centrality of humankind in the cosmic drama. So there wasn't much of a challenge from this quarter to understanding that life was confined to the earth. None, that is, until Thomas Aquinas took up the issue in the Middle Ages. Now, this incident has to be carefully explained. Aquinas was a medieval theologian who, more than anyone else, was responsible for harmonizing Christian theology with Aristotle's thought. He was one of those theologians who believed that the rational abilities God had given to humans were helpful in illuminating faith. Not that it could ever contradict or overturn propositions that were held by faith, but it could help us to understand them better. So Aquinas was willing, in fact eager, to hear what others before him had to say about a variety of issues. And Aristotle had pronounced a view on virtually every subject. So when Aristotle's writings were rediscovered and brought into the Latin West in the Middle Ages, Aquinas made excellent use of them. He crafted a harmonization between Aristotelian thought and Christian theology as good as there was to be found anywhere. Now, there were a few topics where that was problematic, and the official hierarchy wasn't all that convinced that this amalgamating of pagan and Christian thinking was such a good idea. So, after some consideration of various propositions, the church on two occasions condemned what it regarded as heresy. It's the condemnations of 1277 that interest us the most, because that was when the church took a definite position on this question of the possible existence of extraterrestrial life. You see, Aquinas had studied Aristotle's view about life elsewhere, the one I just mentioned, and he agreed with Aristotle that there was no life, as we know it here on Earth, elsewhere in the cosmos. But one thing you have to realize about these condemnations in the 13th century was that there was an agenda behind them. They were aimed at propositions that appeared to limit God's power. And the increasing use of philosophy by theologians at the time, on more than one occasion, some rather strong conclusions had been arrived at through the use of reason. Now, while these conclusions didn't at first glance appear to oppose Christian doctrine, it was the authority of reason as their source that began to concern the papacy. In our case, when Aquinas made it clear that he agreed with Aristotle that there was no life elsewhere, the church understood him to be claiming that there couldn't be life elsewhere, for the kind of philosophical reasons Aristotle gave. It didn't seem to matter that Aquinas had been careful in the way he'd stated his position. Aquinas had made clear, he thought, that he didn't mean God couldn't have created life elsewhere, merely that he hadn't done so. So when the Bishop of Paris, that's the person who drew up a list of offending propositions, most think at the behest of Pope John the 21st, when the bishop misread Aquinas to say that God couldn't have created life elsewhere, he saw it as an example of one of those cases that worried him, a case when the results of reason were dictating to God what God could and couldn't do. Reason was placing limits on God's power, and that was unacceptable. The result? Well, it was set down in Proposition 34, which read that the first cause cannot make other worlds. This was one of the propositions that was condemned as heretical. Now, with this judgment, the Catholic Church officially permitted the idea that life might exist elsewhere, a position that many Christian theologians prior to that time had rejected as pagan. I've gone into this story in some detail because I'm sure the church had no idea what it had just unleashed. It might have sounded like a purely theological matter to the Bishop of Paris and the Pope, but they had no idea how its entanglement with knowledge of the cosmos would come back to haunt Christendom. For example, it wasn't that long before the question arose, still a purely theological question, whether creatures who lived elsewhere were covered by the redemptive sacrifice of Christ. Or would Christ have to go to the other worlds and die again? This theological question would encourage speculation about the nature of other worlds and other possible creatures. And that, naturally, would draw on the latest knowledge of the heavens. As we know, what people thought about the constitution of the heavens in the later medieval period, that was about to change drastically. Well, between the medieval period and the end of the 18th century, a consensus emerged among theologians and natural philosophers alike that extraterrestrial life was likely to exist. For example, reformers like the Lutheran theologian Philip Melanchthon saw no problem with extraterrestrial beings, nor did natural philosophers like Descartes or Leibniz, Newton, and others in the 17th century. Clearly, we don't have time in this course to delve into the intriguing views of these folks on the subject. It's been done thoroughly by historians, and you can refer to the booklet for references that will tell you all you want to know about it. Let me pick up things in the 18th century. By then, the growing field of natural theology, that's the branch of theology devoted to using knowledge of nature to bring glory to the Creator. Natural theologians embraced the existence of other worlds as a clear testimony to God's greatness. Works like William Derham's Astrotheology of 1715 imagined other solar systems outside our own, systems that were, as he said, worthy of an infinite creator whose power and wisdom, as they are without bounds or measure, so may in all probability exert themselves in the creation of many systems as well as one. When Derham and others considered the possibility of other worlds, they meant worlds that were inhabited. And some were pretty bold in their conclusions about the life that existed elsewhere. Even the philosopher Immanuel Kant got into the act. In his book, Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens of 1755, Kant depicted his own hypothesis about the development of the heavens. He imagined that the farther planets were from the sun, the more excellent their inhabitants would be. And the French astronomer Jerome Lalande made it clear around the turn of the century that in his view as a natural philosopher, belief in extraterrestrial life was very compatible with a religious worldview. That was, in fact, a sentiment shared by the majority of people. So, by the beginning of the 19th century, the consensus view was that the idea of other solar systems, the notion of other worlds on which life might exist, was totally compatible with the latest knowledge of the heavens. If some folks were overly enthusiastic in the amount of detail they were willing to infer about the nature and about the amount of life elsewhere, well, there were always some who got carried away. But the idea that there was life elsewhere was commonly accepted, and the assumption was that the existence of other worlds brought nothing but greater reverence to the Creator of it all. As to the question of salvation, that continued to be debated, but by and large, Christians felt that Christ's sacrifice here on earth was sufficient to cover the sins of beings elsewhere as well as here. And then the bombshell hit, right into the middle of this comfortable consensus. No sooner had the majority been comfortable, maybe even a little smug, about the latest knowledge of the heavens, the latest findings revealed by the telescopes of William and Caroline Herschel, that the latest astronomy confirmed their religion. No sooner had they begun to feel good about that than everything seemed to blow up in their faces. And the cause of this disaster? None other than that well-known troublemaker, Thomas Paine. When you picked up Paine's Age of Reason, which came out in 1793, you found yourself being mocked. Paine was merciless against what he called the conceit of Christianity. How could Christians claim to believe in extraterrestrial life and at the same time insist Christ's sacrifice somehow applied to it? Here's what he asked. How could Christians claim to believe that, and now I'm quoting Paine, the Almighty, who had millions of worlds equally dependent on his protection, should quit the care of all the rest and come to die in our world because, they say, one man and one woman had eaten an apple? To Paine, it was not only ridiculous, it was the height of myopic conceit. To think that the scheme of redemption known to earthlings somehow was assumed automatically to apply to other worlds. Or, Paine asked in his derisive tone, should we imagine that the Son of God went traipsing from one world to the next in order to die in each one? Ridiculous. Paine threw down the gauntlet to Christians. Either give up belief in Christ's universal redemptive role or give up belief in extraterrestrial life. You just can't have it both ways. By the beginning of the 19th century, virtually everyone accepted that the Earth was no longer the physical center of the cosmos. The Earth was displaced from the center out to an insignificant position of the third rock from the sun. Nothing special about that role. What then was the basis for this privileged role Christians claimed in the creation? We're insignificantly placed in the cosmos, and Paine implied our religion is equally insignificant in the incredible universe that science has been uncovering. There's just no basis for presuming that Christ's redemption has meaning beyond our planet, other than pride and conceit, that is. Well, the reaction to Paine was quick in coming, and it lasted for years to come. Clearly, he'd struck a very raw nerve. How would religious leaders reply? What would they say to this defiant accusation of conceit? Perhaps it will come as no surprise that most just held the line. The tactic was to recognize Paine for the unbeliever he was. Best just to reassert belief in both Christ's redemption and the existence of other worlds. For example, Timothy Dwight, who was president of Yale University and grandson of the Puritan divine Jonathan Edwards. You remember him in his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? Well, grandson Timothy Dwight took a cosmic view to establish the Earth's significance in the drama of universal redemption. There had been two great rebellions in the history of the cosmos, he declared. The first one took place in heaven, when Lucifer was cast down. And the second one? The second one occurred here, not elsewhere. And then came the dramatic rebuke to Paine. And these are Dwight's words. These two are with high probability the only instances in which the ruler of all things has been disobeyed by his rational subjects. That was America. In Britain, the popular Scottish minister Thomas Chalmers stepped up to the plate and took on Paine. This was the young Chalmers. He would be the same one who would later lead the disgruntled members of the Church of Scotland in their split from the church during the Great Disruption of 1843. I described how important that event was for North British physicists like Thomson, Maxwell, and Rankine in lectures 29 and 30. Well, Chalmers delivered a series of sermons in 1815 entitled Christian Revelation Viewed in Connection with Modern Astronomy. And he didn't shy away from confronting things head on. He too restated the standard view. From his perspective, it was ridiculous not to recognize the universality of God's redemptive plan. Here's what he said to his admiring listeners. To argue, therefore, on the plan of Christian redemption being instituted for the single benefit of the species to which we belong is a mere presumption of the infidel himself. No question about Paine's status there, infidel. The infidel himself. Chalmers was an extremely gifted speaker who could move large crowds of people. A reviewer of his sermonizing wrote that he'd created such a stir that it was as if a new missionary of the gospel had actually arrived from the moon to bring us news of other worlds and to strike infidelity dumb. So, in spite of the continuing reverberations of Paine's bombshell at the beginning of the century, defenders of the consensus view effectively countered it in the minds of most people. And that meant that as new astronomical information appeared, it continued to be appropriated as a testimony to the greatness of God. So new works on extraterrestrial life continued to appear over the first half of the century. There's one I particularly like. It's by a cleric named Thomas Dick, and its long title reads, Celestial Scenery, or the Wonders of the Planetary System Displayed, Illustrating the Perfection of the Deity and a Plurality of Worlds. Came out in 1837. Somehow the author found a way to calculate how many inhabitants lived on the various bodies in our solar system. Not just the planets, but the asteroids, the moons of the planets, and even the rings of Saturn. For example, Mercury had 8,960,000 inhabitants. You might think that Jupiter, being the largest planet, would have the most inhabitants. No, that honor went to those living on the rings of Saturn. Some 8,141,963,826,080. Pretty precise. Don't ask me how he came to these numbers. I'm sure he had a method of some sort. But he listed them all, including, as I said, asteroids, satellites, all known bodies of the solar system at the time. The grand total, something just shy of 22 trillion, and that didn't include Earth. So many in the Christian world had been able to absorb Paine's onslaught and readjust back into the comfortable assumption that the latest astronomy could still be used to bolster the faith. Not that they didn't have to stay on their toes. There was, after all, a growing interest in Laplace's nebular hypothesis. We saw that last time, but as I've mentioned in earlier lectures, the increasing visibility of natural science in the 1830s and 1840s was by and large not regarded as a fundamental threat to religion by most. And now that we've taken several passes over these years in this series, in both physical and biological sciences, we're in a better position to appreciate this. Let me summarize what I'm saying. It's true that natural science generated some sensational claims that appeared to threaten Orthodox Christianity, and Orthodox Judaism for that matter, in the years before mid-century. We've just been examining Paine's charges regarding this question of extraterrestrial life. And there was, of course, Chambers' book with its evolutionary speculations and its emphasis on the nebular hypothesis. And it's true that these developments were accompanied by some fallout, although they alone were hardly wholly responsible for it. Great disruption in Scotland is perhaps the best example. But by and large, before 1850, the discoveries and achievements of natural science were still regarded as beneficial to religion by most people. I've argued that this attitude doesn't really begin to alter fundamentally until after 1848, after mid-century, after the failed revolutions at this time. Then the atmosphere does undergo a shift. It's not that suddenly natural science is seen to be the enemy of religion, certainly not for the majority of people. Rather, there are more and more episodes involving science that reach the public. And to be sure, There are more individuals, like the scientific materialists, for example, who try to make the claim that natural science works against, not in favor of religion. But these individuals, although they get more press, still represented a distinct minority, and the number of converts they persuaded was limited. So I've maintained that even the late 19th century was not a battleground between religion and science. It's been portrayed that way in older histories, but more recently, historians have become convinced that this image of the late 19th century is much more due to an impression that many have in today's world that's carried back to the past with the assumption that it fits there. The impression that science and religion are mutually antagonistic is a widespread assumption in our own day. It's being challenged by a lot of folks, but I have to tell you, I keep running into it all the time. However, in spite of a few celebrated classics that were written as the century wound down, it was not an assumption of most people of the late 19th century. Most people then, being confronted with more and more examples of radical thought on many fronts, not just in natural science, tried hard to work out a position in which they could remain true to their faith. Well, just after mid-century, another bombshell in this issue of extraterrestrial life exploded. It represented one prominent natural philosopher's resolution of the difficulty Thomas Paine, had created, and it ran directly against the grain of the comfortable majority opinion about extraterrestrial life. The author knew his position would be highly controversial, so like Chambers before him, he published his work anonymously. It was called Dialogue on the Plurality of Worlds, and it appeared in England in 1853. The author was right to be concerned. The book created a fiasco. Well, first of all, what was in it? You didn't have to wait long to find out. The author quickly brought the main concern of the book out into the open. What are we to make of the other worlds natural science has shown us are out there where redemption is concerned? It was that old question that had been opened up by the condemnations way back in 1277. Did Christ's sacrifice cover the inhabitants of other worlds? The author's position was very clear. There could be only one Savior. So far, no problem. That's what most Christians thought. But as the author continued, readers smelled something coming that made them uncomfortable. The Savior coming as a man to men, wrote the author, is so essential a part of the redemptive scheme that to endeavor to transfer it to other worlds and to imagine there something analogous as existing is more repugnant to our feeling than to imagine those other worlds not to be provided with any divine scheme of salvation at all. What was that? Did I hear right? What did he say again? Did I hear him say that the Christian redemptive scheme is so central to the universe that it was only played out once here? And did I hear him say that to imagine it to be transported to other worlds was worse than other worlds having no redemptive plan at all? As readers continued, they found their worst fears confirmed. What the author was claiming was that there had been only one drama of redemption, and it had been played out here alone. It was not that inhabitants of other worlds weren't covered by this earthly drama of redemption. There were no other inhabitants. The author was essentially agreeing with Thomas Paine. It was a conceit to think that a plan of redemption on earth applied elsewhere in the universe. It was just that this author drew a different conclusion, different from the one that the dilemma presented earlier. This author, whoever he or she was, denied that there was extraterrestrial life. But everyone believed in the existence of other inhabited worlds. This was scandalous. Wasn't it the consensus among the scientists? Who was this person? One reviewer, exposing the author's identity, expressed his astonishment in these words: "We scarcely expected that in the middle of the 19th century, a serious attempt would have been made to restore the exploded idea of man's supremacy over all other creatures in the universe, and still less that such an attempt would have been made by one whose mind was stored with scientific truths. Nevertheless, a champion has actually appeared who boldly dares to combat against all the rational inhabitants of other spheres. And though as yet he wears his visor down, his dominant bearing and the peculiar dexterity and power with which he wields his arms indicate that this knight-errant of nursery notions can be no other than the master of Trinity College, Cambridge. The author was none other than the very one who had coined the word scientist, William Whewell, the highly respected master of Trinity College, Cambridge. People were astonished. Whewell was known as a defender of natural science. How could such a progressive figure take such a backward-looking position? But take it he did, and his booklet produced a storm of reaction. In fact, the ensuing debate exposed a variety of opinions on the question. As expected, the great majority appeared to oppose Whewell's position. Historian of science Michael Crow has determined that 70% of the books written during the debate that followed opposed Whewell. Among scientists, the percentage was even higher. Some 80% of the scientists favored pluralism, as it was called. Even among Anglicans, over 71% opposed Whewell's conclusion. It was just preposterous in the minds of many that someone in a position like Whewell's, obviously an intelligent person, dared to deny what seemed so obvious to most that life existed elsewhere. But the picture changed a bit when you looked around more widely in the religious community. Among all religious writers, the split between those who supported Whewell and those who opposed him was approximately half and half. Apparently, there was a sizable group of Victorian society that still had doubts about the existence of extraterrestrial life, or at least they were persuaded that the only responsible choice was to avoid Paine's charge of conceit by removing the cause of the charge. Well, as the century wound down, a new debate over extraterrestrial life emerged. This one wasn't focused on the religious question. It drew its energy from the general enthusiasm for extraterrestrial life that many harbored. They liked the idea that there was life elsewhere, maybe right here in our own solar system, maybe on one of our nearest neighbors, maybe on Mars. It came about when the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli tested a new telescope. He was checking its capacity to observe a planetary surface, so he turned it on Mars. What he observed were dark lines across the surface. What were they? He dubbed them channels, canali, and that opened a debate about Martian canals, and that debate would last into the 20th century. Were they signs of life, or were they just natural surface features that had no more meaning than valleys? Schiaparelli favored the view that the channels were natural waterways, but then, on the other hand, he didn't oppose the possibility that they could have been intentionally constructed. I should note that by this time, we're talking about the 1870s and 1880s, a growing number of celestial bodies had been eliminated as fit sites of possible life. In other words, scientists had determined how to tell what elements made up heavenly bodies. It was a new technique called spectral analysis that examined the light coming from celestial objects. So many possible locations for extraterrestrial life had been eliminated since it was determined that they wouldn't support life. Of course, the assumption was that any life out there would be life as we know it. While some doubted that the lines on Mars represented anything real, then near the end of the century, new observations confirmed that the lines were undeniable. Camille Flammarion in France, we met him back in Lecture 30 as the author of drawings depicting the end of the world, and especially Percival Lowell in the United States popularized the notion that Mars could well be inhabited. With these experts coming down on the side of life on Mars, the public was delighted. Eventually, scientists concluded that the atmosphere of Mars was unable to support life, with the possible exception of microbes or primitive plants. We have our own version of this continuing question still around today. But regardless of the question of Mars, belief in the possibility of extraterrestrial life has continued unabated to the present day and is now as strong as ever. It's still a question that fascinates us, as it should. The prospect of life existing elsewhere raises a number of questions about the meaning of human life that are fundamental. And examining our ideas about possible life elsewhere, as some clever writers have shown, is extremely revealing. Since we've never encountered life other than here on Earth, our descriptions of life elsewhere inevitably are occasions for us to reveal what we think about ourselves. Well, in our next lecture, we're going to see how light from distant places in the heavens proved to be a subject that raised other kinds of questions than the ones we've been exploring today. But those questions were in their own way just as daunting, and they will also be occasions for us to encounter some fundamental problems with which natural science constantly struggles.